This was not what Rossum had in mind at all. It's NES Works Gaiden episode 36. Now that Famicom is 2 years old, it's made its first true friend. A little guy by the name of Robert. Well, Rob, actually. Or, in Japan, just Robot. Of course you know this guy already. For Americans who remember the NES, and quite a few who came into fandom sometime later, Rob's face is more or less synonymous with the system. Nintendo designed Rob primarily as a marketing tool for the US, a tale told many times already on NES Works. Just to recap, the American console market had collapsed under the dismal weight of bad Atari 2600 games, losing no end of money for retailers, and Nintendo realized the only real hope it had of convincing a single corporate buyer to nibble on the NES was to bait the hook with gimmicks that obscured the fact that yes, this was basically the new successor to the Atari generation. In order to distract corporate buyers from the fact that the NES was another video game console like the one that had redlined their margins a few years earlier, we had Rob, waving his hands wildly while shouting, "Wow, video robots!" Cartridges were no longer game tapes or whatever, they were game packs that came in boxes that fit right alongside VHS collections. The console was now a control deck that discreetly hid the games with a video deck-like front insertion method. And a wholesome-looking chap in a bow tie was only too happy to tell you about the wonders of this new technology. So Rob did his part by getting Nintendo consoles into retailers in America. Look at this guy, so cool on display. But what about on Famicom, where Rob, or rather Robot, had no real reason to exist? At this point, the Famicom had been around 2 years and its popularity continued to snowball. There was no need for Nintendo to trick consumers or retailers into buying the Famicom, as the biz had exploded a year earlier. And Nintendo's big problem now was preventing the Japanese market from spiraling out of control due to its popularity, the way the Atari business had overseas. Whither then, Robot? As far as I can tell through conversations and observations, the Famicom faithful feel a certain fondness for the Famicom Robot, but it tends to take the form of a sort of quiet amusement, rather than the nostalgic blast of dopamine Americans experience at the sight of his bug-like eye lenses. Robot was just another in a line of oddball add-on peripherals for the Famicom like the Hypershot controller, the inflatable boxing controller, and the plastic ride-on motorcycle. Robot never came packed in with the Famicom hardware, in part because there was no need for such a tactic, but also because Nintendo Corporation Limited just doesn't really do pack-ins the way Nintendo of America and Europe do. Robot also never came packaged with a game. No, everything about Robot sold separately, and it constituted a pretty steep investment. Robot himself cost 9,800 yen, while the game sold for 4,800 and 5,800 yen apiece. Altogether, that added up to more than 20,000 yen, which is to say, approximately speaking, about $50 more than the console itself. A hefty price for a gadget that only had 2 games, and only 1 game worth playing. And Robot didn't even launch alongside the good game. When Robot shipped on July 26, 1985, the only game available for the add-on was this, Robot Block, aka Stack Up. Robot Gyro, aka Gyromite, wouldn't hit for another 2 weeks, leaving hapless robot aficionados reeling for half a month from their disastrous decision to invest $150 into this insubstantial, shambolic ungame. If you've played Stack Up, which statistically is fairly unlikely given its scarcity, but for the sake of argument, if you've played Stack Up, you know exactly what to expect from Robot Block. The Japanese version of the game did not contain hidden features or modes to give it greater substance than the US release, and it did not offer more structured design or appeal. Stack Up is literally the exact same thing as Robot Block, because Nintendo shipped the Japanese software to America inside an NES cartridge with a hastily assembled cartridge adapter. They didn't even change the title screen to be consistent with the US packaging. Literally, the only difference between the two is that Robot Block comes in a small, white cartridge, and its add-on components are molded in standard Famicom burgundy and cream tone plastics. That's it. And there, as here, Robot Block consists of making Robot pick up blocks and stack them in order to make a little guy move around a grid. You can also play a mode where you stack the colored blocks according to an on-screen prompt. There's no real scoring mechanism for this, and no way for the game to confirm you've actually aligned blocks as mandated, so the only win condition is to turn the game off and do something more constructive with your time. So how did Robot Block fare among Japanese audiences? It's difficult to say exactly, but I can attest to the fact that I purchased a new sealed copy of the game a few years ago for less than $100. Compare that to Stack Up, which around the same time sold for about $1,000, even in battered, unhappy, unloved condition. Sure, that could simply be a testament to the fact that Nintendo overproduced Robot Block and underproduced Stack Up, but I prefer to read it as a sign that 2 years of marinating in increasingly good Famicom software had rendered Japanese audiences savvy to bad and worthless software. A sort of weary cynicism that would threaten the well-being of the Famicom market as more third parties rushed to shovel their wares onto the console in pursuit of a quick buck. In the coming years, the Famicom market would teeter at the precipice of the same disastrous collapse that annihilated Atari. And look, here's Nintendo themselves, and Robot, kicking things off. For shame. At the same time, Famicom fans were collectively ignoring the arrival of Robot. They were getting angry about the arrival of a new publisher, ASCII. Well, it's not that they were angry about ASCII so much as they were ASCII's debut title, Geimos. ASCII's arrival marks the second PC-focused publisher to debut on Famicom in rapid succession after Enix. According to an interview with Bulletproof Software founder Hank Rogers, cited on Nintendo Life, Nintendo initially rejected a coalition of computer-focused publishers who hoped to acquire permission to produce Famicom software as third parties. Nintendo said they didn't have the first clue about how to make console games. Clearly, that stance had softened by the summer of 1985. To ASCII's credit, they entered the fray by turning to the best in the biz, Micronix. Well, the title screen credit reads Wixel, not Micronix, but the Game Developer Research Institute establishes pretty convincingly that Wixel was one of several aliases the studio used, along with Chaos with a K. I don't know that Micronix ever received an in-game credit by name, so it could be that they intended to use Wixel for original works, rather than the arcade conversions they would typically deal in. If so, that plan does not seem to have panned out, as the name Wixel would never show up in any other game that I'm aware of. ASCII, on the other hand, would become a mainstay of the Famicom and NES, and they'd even take a little jaunt over to the world of SG-1000 a few months later with the Castle. Anyway, about Micronix. Fresh off their excellent conversion of elevator action, they once again turn in an impressive bit of Famicom software engineering with Geimos. A forward-scrolling shooter, Geimos presents the most convincing pseudo-3D scrolling to have appeared on a console since HAL's F1 race. At a glance, Geimos looks an awful lot like Sega's Zoom 909, which hit SG-1000 in July 1985, right at the same time this game arrived. That's tough luck for Zoom 909. The SG-1000 just wasn't equipped to handle this sort of perspective-based scrolling. Now, the Famicom doesn't exactly knock it out of the park either, and in just a few months, Sega would show the world how to do a behind-the-ship shooter with a superscalar cabinet for Space Harrier. But for the moment, this viewpoint really is about as good as it gets on consoles. So, Geimos. While the most obvious visual point of reference for this game would be Zoom 909, and I have seen it referred to online as a Space Harrier ripoff because apparently ASCII employed time travelers, in point of fact, Micronix and ASCII are riffing on a far more familiar framework here. Yes, that's right, this is a Xevious clone, because of course it is. That said, at least it's an ambitious Xevious clone. Look at that forward-scrolling pseudo-3D. Sure beats the stuffing out of space armor, but yeah, this game wants to be Xevious so bad, you almost feel sorry for it. You have two forms of attack, an air-to-air cannon that can take out targets at any range, and an air-to-ground bomb that fires forward a set distance and can only destroy enemies it hits with pinpoint precision. Even the enemies in questions look extremely familiar. Your first assailants appear to be metallic toruses that spin around a central core. Ground emplacements mostly exist as passive targets, but sometimes they'll take potshots at you. Eventually, a boss appears and has to be gunned down, and then it's on to the next round. And it's fine. The Famicom definitely hits the limits of what it can do here with standard issue ROMs. The scaling of enemies has a sort of erratic quality that makes lining up shots pretty tricky, and it can be hard to make out enemy projectiles against the chaos of scaling sprite clusters and zooming backgrounds. You definitely won't find any of the clever enemy formations and behavior here that made Xevious such a thrill to play. Bad guys pretty much fly out of the screen at you in lines, firing bullets either randomly or in slightly more aggressive patterns. It's fairly repetitive, and at 6 stages long, it's reasonably easy to complete in a single sitting, at least on A difficulty. But it looks good. The developers seemingly burned through most of the game's storage capacity on big showy background graphics of planets. And if nothing else, the scrolling induces 100% less motion sickness vomiting than Exarians. Micronix absolutely spanking Tosei at their own game once again. Of course, the best thing about Geimos is also its most hated, the box art. I was surprised recently to learn that this box illustration ranks among the most reviled packaging ever to ship for Famicom. It is absolutely despised among Japanese Famicom enthusiasts. I guess that's why we can't have good things, because this pop art comic-style drawing is great. There's just no accounting for tastes, I guess. Well, I said there would be a reckoning after the shenanigans that Nintendo pulled with Kung Fu, and here the piper gets paid with Tin Yard Fight. Okay, it's not really a big deal. As I mentioned a couple of episodes ago, Hiroshi Yamauchi undercut Irem's plans to make their Famicom debut with Kung Fu by co-opting the game and having it developed internally and published by Nintendo. That version of Kung Fu turned out great. Honestly, probably better than it would have under Irem's management. No knock against Irem, but few Famicom developers nailed it their first time out. Still, you can certainly understand how Irem's talent might have been pretty perturbed to have their own project wrested away from them. Rather than make their inaugural Famicom appearance with the splashy Kung Fu, Irem instead kicked off with this most unlikely of releases, Tin Yard Fight. Like Kung Fu, this was another arcade conversion, but it was one built around a sport that has little traction in Japan, or outside the US, really. Instead of being able to get things rolling with a slick fighting game based on a popular Jackie Chan movie, Irem instead entered the Japanese home console market with a game that had little intrinsic appeal in that market. Now, this would ultimately pay off. By way of seeming apology for bogarting Kung Fu, Nintendo published Tin Yard Fight at the NES launch, where it did quite well for itself. I wouldn't be surprised to learn that Irem decided to tackle Tin Yard Fight as their first Famicom release, evidently with the aid of Tosei, knowing the game would be exported to the US. Given the popularity of football in the US, it made perfect sense for Nintendo to want to represent the sport in its launch lineup. The NFL hadn't become the monstrosity it is today back in 1985, but it was still a big deal, and Tin Yard Fight seems tailor-made for the market. At the NES launch, Tin Yard Fight was a far sight more impressive than any console football game that had been released in the US to date. And that worked as a boon for Irem, too, given the company wouldn't establish its own US branch and self-publish until late 1987. So Tin Yard Fight gave Irem a taste of the international market 2 years ahead of schedule. That said, despite incorporating some massive changes over the arcade release, Tin Yard Fight doesn't really seem the ideal choice to win the hearts and minds of the Famicom fanbase. In arcades, Tin Yard Fight focused strictly on offense, hence the name. You were battling upfield in 10-yard increments, ever pressing toward a first down. On NES and Famicom, Tin Yard Fight adds a defensive element as well. It's more of a proper traditional football simulator, with control alternating between offense and defense. And, to its credit, I'm absolutely positive this was the first game about American football ever to appeal on any Japanese console, so it definitely has novelty working in its favor. But as novelties go, the fact that Tin Yard Fight was the first Japanese home console game to light up is even harder to top. Yes, the second part of Nintendo's apology for snatching Kung Fu away from its creator's hands was a special and wholly unique manufacturing privilege: light up cartridges. Tin Yard Fight would be the first of several Irem games to include a red LED in its cartridge casing. When the console powers on, the LED draws power from the cartridge slot and lights up. Now, the earliest Famicom third parties all manufactured their own carts, unlike on NES, where Nintendo required all external publishers to have their games produced by Nintendo's own factories. But while those publishers' carts featured interesting quirks, such as being imprinted with that company's name, or the way Konami's carts included what appears to be a hole for sliding into a keyring or something, none of them included a light-up effect. Former Irem producer Scott Sumura says he specifically requested this feature, not only because it would make the company's games stand out, but also because he was bothered by the fact that the Famicom hardware lacked a power-on LED to provide a quick visual indication that it was running, a feature Nintendo would notably add to the NES. So, Tin Yard Fight was both stylish and functional. What more can you ask? Except the right to produce home ports of your own damn games. Next time on NES Works Gaiden, Sunsoft has entered the chat.